I witnessed, recorded, and produced these videotapes of the Washington, D.C. hearing. Their authenticity is above question.
This is produced as part of the ongoing work on the website, thewaythetruthandthelife.net.
This is a hearing about the government licensing the electrocution of people to cause grand mal seizures. Think of the millions of dollars, taxpayers' money, spent to pay psychiatrists and their supporters and for the worldwide travel in putting this conference together, while the victims and opponents had to pay their own way.
Wait a minute. There's another speaker yet. There's another speaker.
The next speaker this morning will be Dr. Loren Roth, speaking on data on informed consent for ECT. Dr. Roth.
Of the legal and ethical doctrine. Is it possible to obtain informed consent for ECT? What are the barriers for physicians and patients in fulfilling the ideal of informed consent? What do we know empirically? By way of introduction, I should state my conclusion, namely that while obtaining informed consent is a necessity for administering ECT, it is also an ideal that may not be achieved in all cases. The limited empirical data available suggests that it is possible to obtain meaningful informed consent from the majority of depressed psychiatric patients for ECT, even from most severely depressed patients who admittedly are not ideal decision makers with respect to choosing treatment. Nevertheless, a minority of patients, we really do not know what percentage, in my experience from the data available, probably less than 1/4 of such patients, may, however, be unable to make a treatment decision. It would be better to have proxy decision makers decide for them. This minority of patients includes both those who consent to and refuse ECT. Now, fundamentally, obtaining informed consent is a problem of human communication. As our session yesterday indicated, there are problems in human communication, and these may be more severe when illness is involved. Next, from the studies that I and my colleagues have conducted, as well as the more than 100 empirical studies that we have reviewed, it is clear, and I want to emphasize this, that informed consent must be viewed as a process, not an event. Informed consent is more than a patient's signature on a lengthy consent form, which he does not understand. Over-reliance on consent forms, while perhaps understandable from the perspective of legal protection, must not divert the attention of doctors and patients from the necessary and time-consuming process of mutual education about the patient's values and about the alternatives, purposes, and risks and benefits of ECT. Next, for the minority of patients who are incapable of consenting, other mechanisms need to be put in place wherein the patient's lack of decision-making capacity can be adjudicated and a substitute decision-maker appointed. In practice, sanctioning substitute consent, a process usually involving the courts, as you heard about from Mr. Pari, takes place in a very small percentage of cases. The empirical data suggesting 3 to 4% of such cases. That is my data and data from California. It is important to recognize that much more research is required. Considering the importance that has been given to informed consent in statute and regulation, more empirical studies are badly needed. The requirement for informed consent should not be used as a battering ram in an attempt to outlaw treatment, which in my clinical experience is efficacious. In this respect, I think you will find interesting some empirical data that I will discuss indicating that psychiatrists and attorneys have a different orientation towards consent, consistent with their professional socialization and bias. By way of background, I will omit discussion of common law, judicial, statutory, and regulatory developments in informed consent. In making studies, I and my colleagues pursue a 5-part model, including voluntariness, information provision, competence, understanding, and decision. One can conceptualize informed consent as a model wherein information about treatment is given to a patient who is freely situated, able to choose, has the capacity to understand the information and act upon it, and who understands the information and thereupon decides. It's beyond the scope of this talk for me to review the many empirical studies that have been performed relating to consent in medicine and surgery. Suffice to say that I and my colleague, Mr. Meisel, have reviewed these studies critically. We have found many and most of them wanting. The majority of studies focus on only one element of consent, patient understanding of consent forms. Unfortunately, practically all studies have omitted a critical dimension, namely documenting and ensuring that relevant information has truly been given to patients. It is wrong to conclude that patients did not give valid consent when patient understanding of treatment is tested at some remote time for decision making. Patients forget, as we all do, about many things. The relevant question for law, ethics, and the professions is whether at some point, at some time, patients were given relevant information that they used or had an opportunity to use in reaching a decision. The empirical studies in consent, now numbering some 100, are not optimistic. A comparative perspective must be kept in mind. To the extent psychiatric patients have difficulty in providing consent, it cannot be assumed that such difficulties do not occur in other aspects of medicine or are uniquely derivative of patient psychopathology. The empirical studies suggest that medical and surgical patients often do not understand or retain information given to them about treatment. Patients typically demonstrate understanding of about 30 to 70% of material relevant for consent. And although I am going to review some of the factors in the general studies, they're in my full paper, I will say they are very similar to those which we are about to discuss. Let me turn to some of the studies that have been performed in psychiatry relating to ECT. Dr. Freeman and Kendall, you just heard from Dr. Freeman, in 1980 reported a retrospective study with 166 psychiatric patients who were asked about the treatment some 1 to 2 years later, but in some cases more. Only 20% of patients reported they had received an adequate explanation of treatment before it began. Interestingly, the great majority of patients did not complain about the consent procedures. They indicated it was the doctor's decision. Retrospective studies in informed consent for ECT are inevitably compromised by the impact of ECT on memory and registration around the time of treatment and consent. Freeman and Kendall note that patients have been informed. They suggest that patients should be told more about treatment at a later time when ECT is completed. More recently, in a brief unpublished study, Baxter and his colleagues from UCLA administered multiple choice questions to 35 patients about their knowledge about ECT. They found on average post-consent, this immediately, patients were correct in their knowledge on 17 of 20 questions where knowledge was tested. These investigators found that it did not matter whether patients saw a videotape about ECT or received an oral explanation in terms of knowledge they possessed. That's my experience too. There are no shortcuts that will get away from one-to-one doctor-patient communication. Over the last 10 years, my colleagues and I have conducted a number of related studies about consent for ECT, research, and medication. We've used different techniques, making observational studies documenting doctor-patient communication. We've utilized a two-part consent form approach that I'm going to discuss. And finally, we've done videotape studies where I play the role of clinician educator, educating patients about ECT, capturing the disclosure and patient's understanding for later viewing by neutral judges. Now I'm going to tell you about our studies. Over a one-year period, we attempted to study all depressed hospitalized patients who received ECT at Western Psych. Because of failure of recruiting procedures, we missed 12 patients. 13 refused to participate. This left a final sample of 57 patients, 4 consenting, 13 refusing. They were sick. 1/3 had had ECT previously, 25 were psychotic or possibly psychotic. Following their consent or refusal, these completed a two-part consent form asking 15 questions about the treatment. A considerable amount of work went into the development of these forms to ensure reliability and validity. We broke down patients' knowledge into types of understanding, legal categories relevant to consent, understanding of procedures, risks, and benefits, and so forth. Patients were asked to fill out the questionnaires on their own, but we also provided assistance for patients who were unable or unwilling to read the consent form or to answer questions. This simple procedure was itself very revealing. 1/3 of the patients that we tested were unable to work on the form without aid, some requiring aid for 1/2 or 1 hour. Some patients said they were too anxious, sick, or tired to read the consent form or answer questions. They were afraid or nervous. They regarded the testing of their understanding as a test of ability and felt they would flunk. Others with aid patients were overtly occupied with delusional concerns, slow, psychomotor retarded, withdrawn, uncommunicative, or agitated. These signs and symptoms of mental illness are some of the barriers that stand in the way of educating patients about ECT. An interesting finding in this portion of the study was that a disproportionate number of patients with less education required aid. Written consent forms are very intimidating to read and think about for patients of lower educational background. This should be watched very carefully. This portion of the study can briefly be summarized. A substantial minority of patients fail to understand significant amounts of information on the form. Among the patients, 17 to 57, or about 30%, understood half or less of the information, while 54% understood more than two-thirds. Patients who had a higher proportion of correct responses were younger, had education greater than high school, were of higher occupational status, did not require aid, were not psychotic, consented to rather than refused ECT, and were diagnosed as neurotic or without organic syndromes. Let me have the first slide, please. I'm going to run through the slides rather quickly. This slide basically indicates that the total knowledge of the various categories was in the region of about 60% on the various categories we discussed. We also tried to calibrate true understanding. I'm not going to go into all the methods, but did not simply rely on recall as other studies have done, testing patients' understanding of language on the form and ability to reason from it. Let me see the next slide. Table 2 shows some of the correlations. This is a multivariate results in which stepwise multiple regression is used to find out which factors are most efficient in predicting the understanding score. This aid dimension turned out to be a major prediction. There were also univariate correlations with occupation, psychosis, education. It is insufficient, however, you might as well leave the lights on because I'm going to have other slides. It is insufficient, however, to conclude that patients can or cannot give informed consent on the basis of understanding consent forms. Forms that are lengthy, use technical jargon, are poorly structured, have a deleterious effect on consent. Too frequently they are constructed by lawyers, administrators, or others with medical legal aims in mind, not with the aim of patient education. To the extent consent forms play an important role in informing patients, they should be written by educators. They should be pre-tested concerning their efficacy for the population for which they are meant to be used. We are pursuing the idea of information sheets rather than the consent forms. In the next portion of the study, I studied a subgroup of 57 patients who had filled out the ECT consent form. 23 patients, 15 consenting, 8 refusing. Here the purpose was to take a psychiatric history, elicit the patient's psychopathology, explore in depth the patient's understanding of the form, and then again teach the patient about ECT. This technique assured adequate disclosure. Among other findings, this technique clearly revealed that full information disclosure about ECT is not toxic to patients nor contraindicated. For example, I specifically told many patients who did not know what happened when they went to sleep that they were going to have electric current put across the brain, that the purpose was to induce a convulsion, that this was part of the treatment, and what have you. You can be quite frank, in my experience, with patients in giving information. What patients want is not to be a decision maker. They want to know what is going to happen to them. There were 1 or 2 cases in that group where I exercised a so-called therapeutic privilege. I can discuss that perhaps in the question, but the great majority of patients can be given very frank information. And I feel we have the data to say that. These videotapes were then reviewed by neutral and experienced judges, 2 psychiatrists and 2 lawyers to watch them from start to finish, some 50 hours of viewing, and provided scaled estimates of the patient's level of understanding and competency to give informed consent. While the above elements are a critical portion of the doctrine, there is still no good guidance about how understanding a patient should be. Similarly, there are no agreed-upon standards for assessing patient competency. We propose several standards: ability to make the choice, understand information, rationally manipulate information, appreciate the issues involved. But there's no concurrence in this area. Some depressed patients who are rational in certain respects may nevertheless deny mental illness, be despairing or pessimistic, such that they cannot rationally evaluate the benefits of the treatment. Therefore, they reject it or review the treatment as not relevant to their condition. Some patients manifest cognitive deficits, which are state-related. The patient denying past efficacy despite objective evidence to the contrary. The findings of this portion of the study were, despite education, that the understanding of 11 of 23 videotape patients were evaluated by the judges no greater than fair. 6 were evaluated as falling at the lower end of the competency scale. These results should be put in the comparative framework I mentioned above and are not appreciably different from results elsewhere in medicine. Let me have the next slide. I won't spend a lot of time on this. This is the same type of multivariate approach showing to the extent that we could predict the judgments of understanding and competency with some of the same factors emerging. Most significant about this slide, keep this on while I talk, is the importance of the test of specific understanding. I want to emphasize this. I think Mr. Pari emphasized it. The single most predictive factor concerning whether patients are judged understanding or competent is the ECT score. In this research, a test of specific understanding. Rather than speculating about patient understanding and competency, the single most valuable technique in obtaining informed consent is to put the patient through his paces, give information, attempt to retrieve it, correct misunderstanding, and try again. While patients who are severely ill and very disturbed, and in this sense generally competent, are more likely to be specifically incompetent, when put through their paces, there is far from a one-to-one correlation between severity of illness and type of patient. Among the patients rated by the judges as incompetent, 5 were delusional. These patients believed that the purpose of the ECT, as stated by one consenting patient, was to make me die, or as one refusing patient stated, because the doctor wants to get rid of me. One of the incompetent patients was excessively preoccupied with somatic delusions, and the entire information disclosure was irrelevant. 2 evaluated as incompetent were virtually mute. Others were agitated, poorly concentrated, couldn't follow discussion. 3 of the patients manifested extreme ambivalence, alternatively consenting and refusing within several days, repetitively. During the course of our research, not all patients whose understanding of ECT was poor or fair reached legal proceedings. When alternate treatments are possible, or when the family does not support the idea that ECT should be given, and or there is no emergency, clinical staff are reluctant to pursue full legal proceedings. The time, money, and inconvenience of court hearings is considered. Factors are often regarded as not of critical importance by legal advocates and patients. They can be a significant barrier. For example, it can take 1 to 3 weeks to have a court hearing and cost $1,000. The patient's relatives are not always willing to absorb the cost. Therefore, the hospital must. In many states, mechanisms to facilitate court hearings are not in place. During the course of our research, only 3 patients of the more than 70 that we attempted to study ever had legal hearings. All were refusing, all found incompetent. Interestingly, these patients were so severely disorganized that none of them were able to participate effectively in our research. They were agitated and uncooperative. In my experience, court hearings occur not only because of the physician's judgment that the patient was incompetent, but because physicians fear that the patients might deteriorate or die without treatment. In my experience, court hearings seldom occur when treatment is elective. Thus, most formal court hearings relate to incompetency occur in urgent situations. One of the more interesting features of the research that we performed was a study of how psychiatrists and lawyers reached their decisions. They went about it in a different way. I don't have time to discuss this in great detail, except to say that there was greater agreement between the psychiatrists and the lawyers in their judgments. There was less agreement when patients were refusing. There's a value-laden portion of the incompetency judgment. Let me have the next slide. What this shows is that shown the very same videotape material, psychiatrists, compared to lawyers, prefer to take the decision away from the patient, whereas the lawyers prefer to accord the decision to the patient. They're using a different framework for evaluation. One, the evaluation, the framework of rights, the other, the framework of needs. Let me have the next slide. I'm going to start on some conclusions. Guidelines for informing patients. I'll do this quickly. The psychiatrist should himself be informed about what is scientifically known and accurate about ECT. Otherwise, what is told the patient is a manipulation for consent or for refusal. Secondly, the presentation should be non-technical. Third, psychiatrists should have familiarity with the patient so that the information can be individualized and the patient's dynamic concerns taken into account. This takes time. Other potential informants, such as family or friends, should be utilized. Finally, information needs to be repeated. Lastly, moralism. The patient should be as free as possible to make his choices. Next, I want to say something about pressures. Unfortunately, this subject is virtually unstudied. Coercion, using the most bare formulation of that concept, was not a problem in our study. Nevertheless, clinical staff persisted in repetitively suggesting that patients receive ECT when they believed it was clearly needed. When in the physician's judgment there are no alternatives, when the treatment is in effect a last resort, then physicians typically persist in attempting to obtain consent. I believe this is as it should be. It's sometimes asserted that pressures of illness render the patient unable to choose. This issue is philosophic and semantic. Difficult to set guidelines. The pressures the patient experiences both a pressure and a legitimate stimulus towards treatment. More important, in my view, is that external threats not be made, nor punishments meted out. Final comments very briefly concerning the questions that addressed you. First, I will boldly state that I do not believe that the distinction between voluntary and involuntary patients is of any significance regarding consent. Both types of patients need to give consent, and that has been the trend in the trend in the law. What about patients who are poorly understanding and the relatives agree? Most of these patients, in our experience, go ahead and get treatment. There's an argument whether court hearings should be held. There's a deterrent held in court hearings when the patient's understanding is fair and the relatives agree, because it's a wheel-spinning operation. You can go to court, spend all the money, the relatives will consent, you're no further ahead. I'll just finish in the last minute, I hear more than 30 seconds. In my experience, the more interesting question is what happens when relatives are opposed to treatment. The patient appears incompetent. The physicians feel the patient should have treatment. In this eventuality, I advise going to court where the physician becomes the patient's advocate. We should not let family indifference to treatment necessarily conflict with the patient's best interest. I've in effect indicated the needed studies in my talk so far. We know very little about this subject. My study may not be fully representative. It was conducted at the university hospital. We need many more studies in different settings about patient competency, what doctors tell patients, how patients reach decisions, so the policy can be guided. Finally, the study should be naturalistic, not experimental. Thank you.
One shock treatment can equal 150 joules of energy. This is equal to dropping a hammer on someone's head from higher than a 5-story building.
At the FDA hearings, the testimony on the reclassification of electroconvulsive devices cited the literature as whether signed or pulsed, typically about 150 joules of energy in a treatment. With the new Thymatron electroconvulsive device, if you check out at 400 volts, maximum of 0.9 amps, and 320-some millisecond pulses.
Could you finish up your question, your remarks?
Yeah, I would like somebody to tell me. I'm a teacher as well as a physicist, and I brought a kilogram with me. Teachers like to demonstrate. Now, this is a kilogram. It's 2.2 pounds. Heavier than a hammer used to hit an amp. That I wonder if possibly like Dr. Stein could tell me how high I would have to drop this kilogram from in order to have it hit the ground with 150 joules of energy.
I don't know if that question is in the purview of the panel, but that should be important. I'd like to go on to the next person.
This is only 10 joules of energy. You're talking about dropping it from higher than a 5-story building. That's physics. Supposedly in pre-med backgrounds.
Thank you.
I never got
All right, out with your gun. Huh? Out with your gun.
Okay, this won't hurt. It'll be over in just a moment.
Uh-huh. What's that?
Conductant.
Oh, dabble, do you? Right, Mr. Jackson?
Open your mouth.
What's that?
This will keep you from biting your tongue.
Well?
Now just bite down on it.
Oh.
That's right. Just bite down. Now bite down on it.
Good. Are you ready? Here we go.